This episode, I'm joined once again by Paul Bishop to discuss the philosophy of Ludwig Klages, primarily from his text, The Science of Character, alongside discussions on characterology, Geist and Seele. I'd like to say a big thank you to my paying patrons and subscribers for making all of the work possible, and if you'd like to support the podcast and keep everything running, as it runs off patronage and donations alone, please find links in the description below. Otherwise, please enjoy. So, Paul Bishop, thanks once again for joining us on Hermitix podcast.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me back.
We are going to be once again discussing the work of Ludwig Klages from his 1929 book, Grundlagen der Charakterkunde, which is available online for free. And I believe we were discussing before that this was it has a complicated publication history and is based on some lectures he gave. So originally published in 1929, but has a peculiar history.
That's right. Like a lot of works by Klages, he recycles. That's an unkind way of putting it. He reenacts, he reworks, he rethinks through. You'll find in most cases, and that's what makes him difficult to track in philological terms, that he revises a lot of his own material. And also in places here, he quite cheerfully quotes himself. He says, this is what I'm going to do in a sort of Oscar Wilde-like way.
Lots of Klages. He has a lot of flair in that way. Now, there is, however, a contemporary reason as to why our discussion here came about. It's because of an article in Arctos published earlier this year entitled The Characterology of Ludwig Klages. Now, I will quote the opening paragraph from this article. And this is obviously what we're going to be discussing, which is the science of character, Grundlagen der Charakterkunde, which is the characterology. So this article titled The Characterology of Ludwig Klages begins, Klages developed a reactionary school of psychophysical thought capable of, in quotes, psychoanalyzing not just individuals, but races and even material structures such as buildings or cities. His work in some ways anticipates and outstrips postmodernism. Now, this is a bit of a reactionary gunshot off the mark, immediately trying to take Klages somewhere where we both feel really he doesn't belong. Now, there are, of course, there are undoubtedly reasons, if we're being fair and contextual, there are undoubtedly reasons as to why people might be hasty in taking Klages in a certain direction. But as we were discussing before, if you then take the next step, which you need to, because Klages really is a philosopher, you realize it really is complete nonsense to keep him in this, let's call it the reactionary frame.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair comment, and of course that opening remark that's there in this blog piece, Klages developed a reactionary school of psychophysical thought. That's meant to be a good thing as far as these folks are concerned, because they're wanting to claim Klages for essentially right-wing thoughts, in which reactionary counts as something positive. But it's interesting, of course, because it's actually precisely that same claim, the reactionary school of thought, which Klages' critics use against him as well. So it's curious that everything is turning around this point about is it a good or a bad thing to be reactionary or so on. In fact, I wouldn't say Klages fits into any of those categories at all. I mean, that's really not a helpful way of thinking about him, and the reason why the Characterology, the science of character, is such a good book is because it offers another way into his thinking, which is less immediately metaphysical. Does get metaphysical, but it's less immediately metaphysical than many of his other works, and certainly than his great magnum opus, Spiritus Adversary of the Soul, sadly still not yet translated to Geist and Seele. So it's another point of entry into the richness of Klages' thought.
I mean, I think we did clarify it in the other talk, and I clarified it in a couple of talks I gave from Gunnar Alskness' book on Klages, which is really one of the good places to begin, along with your own book. Would it be almost tongue-in-cheek to call Klages, because people call him reactionary, which I think drags him into a politics which is so limited that he just wouldn't be interested in it. Whereas, if I'm understanding correctly, I mean, he's someone who's trying to reach back to antiquity. So we could almost call him like a hyper-reactionary, to the point where it just doesn't even mean anything anymore, because he's reaching back so far as to actually, and then this is where the politics, and I think, and the metaphysics coincide is he's trying to reach back into consciousness, into a different state of consciousness. And this is what people, of course, said about him was, this is a man who you feel is from another time completely.
Yeah.
Could there be something in that, do you think?
I think that's very fair. There's undoubtedly a kind of theory of history in Klages' thought, and in this respect, you can compare him with contemporary thinkers like Oswald Spengler, again problematic for many, and Klages, I think, is basing a lot of his theory of history on the work of Bachhofen. Bachhofen, the late 19th century Swiss scholar, puts forward or develops, at any rate, in a very schematic way, the idea of matriarchy, the idea that there is a matriarchal period which precedes the patriarchal age, and matriarchy is good and patriarchy is bad on this account. And so you can see there's an interesting kind of proto-feminist angle that's being worked out in Klages and in Bachhofen as well. And then since patriarchy, it's all downhill. And there is undoubtedly a pessimistic, and I think that's an accurate use of the word pessimistic in this occasion, pessimistic angle. In fact, one might even say an apocalyptic angle to Klages' thought. But I think it would be unfair to portray him as simply kind of hand-wringing and lamenting, and it was also much better in the old days. He certainly does think it was much better in the old days, but as you suggested, that means that he's interested in understanding those old days. So there is a kind of archaeology of culture, an archaeology of thought, which he's interested in as well.
And it's interesting. So this, for me, is the defining. You mentioned that matriarchal vision. I mean, this to me is really what drew me to Klages' work, because it's extremely. I mean, it's just peculiar. This understanding of, if I remember it correctly, almost. The feeling of it was almost like a primal matriarchal soup of eros, which in connection with a sort of cosmic vision, and anything which sort of penetrates, I think, to visualize it upwards is we could call it totalitarian or authoritarian, is the patriarchal phallus penetrating through and sort of ruining this primal cosmic, is it animism? I don't know, but something like that. And it's there that I found, how in the world can anyone ever conflate this with a sympathy of Nazism? Because Nazism is almost the archetypal vision of the authoritarian phallus penetrating this thing which Klages is philosophizing. So those two things just don't work. So I want to get that out of the way, that you can't have both of those together, I think.
I would agree. I would agree with that analysis, and just that in 2 points. And one is to say that the National Socialists themselves didn't like Klages, and that Klages was his thought was singled out for negative comment and for criticism by Nazi philosophers in quotation marks. And of course, in the 30s and 40s, Klages wasn't in Germany. He'd moved to Switzerland at the outbreak of the First World War. And I think it's very hard to claim for him in any serious way a German nationalism straight of his thought. Where I think the misprision comes in is because he is interested in the idea of German culture, what makes something German. That's because he comes from it. And you could also ask the same thing about what is specific about French culture, about Italian, or about American, or anything specific. There's nothing suprematist in the way that Klages discusses German culture. It obviously has an immediacy for him, but he's also very interested in other cultures as well. And this is to try and swing back to another aspect of what you were saying, is that he is almost a kind of campaigning figure for the dangers of colonialism and what this has done to indigenous peoples, to primitives, to use the language of Klages, but it's also the language of Klages' day. But it's a bit like when Freud talks about early forms of human society. the real primitives are us. The primitive in a negative sense are we moderns, because the primitives in the colonial sense aren't at all. They are the people who have a connection with the landscape, connection with the environment, who are not endlessly rushing around drawing up spreadsheets and unrolling 5-year plans, and so in this sense are in a, as you said, an erotic kind of environment and an erotic relationship to being. And so there is not only a very strong anti-colonial aspect to Klages' thought, but there is also a wider appreciation of saving what can be found in earlier cultures. And in a week where recently in Brittany, I don't know if you've come across this story where 50 standing stones in Carnac in the north of France have been bulldozed down to make way for a Monsieur Bricolage, a do-it-yourself store. This is the kind of destruction that Klages points to when he says, if you let Geist, we'll doubtless come back and talk about Geist, when you let Geist and the will to power get out of control, this is the sort of destruction that you will see in social terms, environmental terms, cultural terms. Klages, it seems to me, is absolutely on the ball in describing what's happening today.
Mm. So would you describe that as a will to power, or is it almost like a will to quantity? A will to quantity, a will to overpower. Will to power, as Nietzsche understands it, I think is essentially a power over and against oneself. It's self-overcoming that produces the Übermensch. But there is a will to overpower, which I think one can see Klages like other Nietzschean thinkers using to analyze. What is it that drives these people? And in Klages' case, this is part of his negative understanding of the will. The will is essentially negative because it is destructive, because it is always going around doing things and not allowing things to happen to it, which is what Klages would see as the essence of the erotic relationship, the erotic understanding to be. So the will is just taking on itself and trying to direct itself against the world, whereas for Klages, which is once again, that seems to be the difference between the patriarchal and the matriarchal. So for Klages, one should have a more. Would submissive be the wrong word?
It's interesting because Hingebung, submission, is one of the characterological dispositions that he talks about, and I think it's interestingly translated as devotion. So devotion is probably a better term rather than submission, because submission is a kind of a more political kind of understanding. Here, Hingebung, devotion would be a kind of admiration for, an acceptance of excellence in something else.
And that for Klages would be that sort of matriarchal primal nature.
That's right, and you talked about the image of penetration, and that's something which one often finds in Klages' writing, in his little essay on the nature of consciousness, where he keeps on talking about the way that our Auffassung, the way that we apprehend the world, is disturbed by what he calls the Durchdringung des Geistes. So again, that's actually this penetrative image, the penetration of the spirit, forcing the two poles of the individual, the body and the soul, apart in the image that he uses. So we could also claim Klages, I think, for being often a critique of phallocentrism as well.
So the body and the soul is bringing us a very, very rough jump here, but to the individual. And what we're really talking about today, which is it's a book which I think if you just listen to our previous conversation, and if you would English speaking as most of the listeners are, and only got your hands on the other Klages stuff, you might think, what is this book on characterology and early forms of psychology, and also now many forms of, we could say, analysis of the individual, which have long since either been disregarded or would be considered complete hogswash, such as graphology and also some phrenology as well. What is this book even doing in Klages' oeuvre? And it's a very short book as well, very dense, very peculiarly written. I mean, it just sort of starts almost you feel like you're in the middle of a conversation when it starts. So what's this book doing here? What do you think Klages' point with this book was?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think that it comes out of, or it marks the beginning of Klages' trajectory as a thinker, as he shifts away from empirical science to doing his own philosophical thing, if you like. Remember, Klages starts off as a scientist, and he does a dissertation on the synthesis of Menthon. And then, because he's in Munich, he starts, thanks to membership of the circle around Stefan George, another seminal figure for understanding the 20th century, tends to be a bit neglected these days too, unfortunately. And in Stefan George, in this circle, he starts to move away from empirical science and chemistry in particular via graphology, which you mentioned, a pseudoscience. I think we can fair enough to call it that, though Klages takes it seriously. And in fact, some companies still do. I understand that some Swiss companies still do graphological analyses if you're applying for a job there. So that might be interesting to do. But the key is that what Klages develops is what he calls an Ausdruckskunde, a theory of expression. And I think this is the key term for understanding what Klages is on about. That is, that we see the world as something which is expressive, speaking to us. The Ausdruck of the world, the Ausdruck of other people make an Eindruck, an impression on us. And this is a very different model from that kind of penetrative model that he's talking about, because an Ausdruck is something which reflects an acceptance of otherness, a working with otherness, an appreciation of otherness. And it forms part of, I would say, Klages' extraordinary ambition, which is to develop an entirely new metaphysical system. I think we can say he does that. That's what he does in Spiritus Adversary of the soul. Everybody else has got it wrong, apart from a few people like Heraclitus and so on, until Klages comes along. But the whole Platonic, post-Platonic, German idealist, all of these things, they all get wrong until a Nietzschean thinker like Klages can come along and can rewrite the history of metaphysics. And then he also wants to rewrite, as it were, the history of psychology as well. What he wants to develop, I think, is a new psychology. And critically, he wants to develop a psychology which has nothing to do with psychoanalysis. And I think that one of the important things about Klages' thought, and in particular this book, Science of Character, is that he's trying to offer us a non-psychoanalytic view of the self, a non-psychoanalytic psychology. And of course, because we are so saturated by psychoanalysis, it's difficult for us to appreciate that.
I was just about to say that. I mean, I was then thinking, what does that even mean? Because people, even now, I mean, psychologists, contemporary psychology, the majority of it would either say, all right, here's a 4-year course in psychology, here's your single lecture on Freud, and maybe you'd be lucky if you get a lecture on Jung. It would maybe, I guess, out of that, the psychoanalytical oeuvre, I think it's Adler, who is the one who sort of got taken through, right? But even then, all of that gets watered down. Just keep watering things down. Even Skinner's been watered down. Point being, however, is that they are the roots. Psychoanalysis is the root of modern psychology, whether they want to admit it or not. So to think about what psychology would be without that, I mean, what is it without that for Klages?
Yeah. No, I think you're quite right that in the, for want of a better word, scientific psychology as taught and studied at universities and implemented in healthcare, that psychoanalysis plays a very, very small role there. That role of it is very much dialed down and dismissed. It's only looked at as historically. In terms of the arts and humanities, I think that psychoanalysis has been far more important. But I think it's beginning to shift. I think it's beginning to shift in two ways. First of all, Freud becomes, I think, increasingly difficult in an era of gender fluidity and gender studies to be seen as offering something which is helpful. And the whole idea of penis envy is not really going to please anybody these days. And so that creates, I think, difficulty from a Freudian perspective. In the case of Jung, I think he's been the great missed opportunity as far as arts and humanities is concerned. But that doesn't make him any more likely to be accepted in the general direction of travel of arts and humanities at the moment. But so, in a sense, there is an opportunity here to open up Klages for new readers by saying he's trying to present a view of psychology which is non-psychoanalytic. He has pot shots at Freud. He has pot shots at Jung. They're pretty much disguised, but you can identify who they are. And the key difference, I think, is that he wants to offer us a psychology, psychoanalysis, if you like, without an unconscious. And that's a pretty bold and brave thing to try and do.
What I mean, I guess to stay on that line, yeah, it is bold. Why do we, I guess for Klages, because the unconscious explains why we do things which are, put very simply, things which we shouldn't really want to do, but we do anyway. The return of the repressed, the drives, the emotions, the forces coming through from somewhere, etc., etc. We do things which are not in our best interest. Why do we do them? Here's your answer. Why do individuals, human beings, do things for Klages? What's the reasoning without an unconscious?
That's right. Well, I think your eloquent summary there of some of the key aspects of psychoanalysis shows just how successful psychoanalysis has been as a movement. We all know psychoanalysis. We all have certain psychoanalytic concepts which are floating around. Even if the contemporary discourse is not immediately psychoanalytic, the whole talk about mental health, the whole discourse around mental health very often reflects an understanding of the self which is psychoanalytic in its origins. What Klages does, I think, is rather than having this model of ego as a kind of center of consciousness, the id as the libidinal drive, and then the superego as a kind of sort of tacked on moral bit. Now, confusingly, Klages does use the terms ego-ish and id-s, and in a way, one could make a claim for him as even anticipating Freud in that way. But they're doing very, very different things. Because to answer your question as best I can, what he's wanting to do in his understanding of how humans act and interact is to look at them in terms of drives, but not simply drives in the Freudian sense of Triebe, but what he calls Triebfeder, drive instincts, drive triggers. It's a tricky notion because we have to divest ourselves of this Freudian understanding of what the drive is. And the best way to begin to think about it is if one looks at the 1929 edition, and one looks at right at the very back of the book, the last few pages that are available on the website, you'll see these fantastic tables which are set out where Klages will answer your question, James, and in a more full way than you would ever have imagined or even wanted, in terms of the interaction of different drives, what he called bonds, forces that make us hold on to things, and releases, aspects that we let go.
Bonds. Now, there's a turbulent word in the history of philosophy.
Yeah, it's, yeah.
Is he? I have to ask: is he drawing on esoteric history there with the notion of bonds? Because most famously, I would think of Giordano Bruno with bonds, and in relation to Klages' sort of sympathies towards occultism and things like this, or some cosmic something beneath where there is these holds, these bonds.
Yes, good. It's a good question. Now, Klages, I think, does two things. He's very very quick to claim to be working in certain traditions. I suppose Heraclitus comes to mind, or his embrace of some of the more scientific minds of German Romanticism. other areas where you would think he'd make a connection and he doesn't. And I guess one has to take a personal view as to whether he's keeping that quiet, or whether in fact there really isn't a connection there to him admit to. He is interested in these esoteric, perhaps rather than occult ideas. And one can see that in the way that, for example, he derives a lot from Goethe's Die christliche Mystik. But I think in this case here, where he's talking about bindende Antriebe, lösende Antriebe, so binding forces or releasing forces, it's because he's trying to explain dynamics without having recourse to a Freudian model. And it's not that these things are binary. It's that they can take hold of us in different ways, at different times. They interact with other people's driving forces, Triebfeder, as well. In other words, he's trying to offer, and I think this is a very important aspect about his characterology, he's not trying to offer a theory of types. He's trying to offer something which is essentially dynamic, and to see the human being in a way that is essentially a dynamic unit.
So it seems that there is a connection with the philosophy in the sense that it seems like a reciprocal relationship with the world, which we've already, the Klagesian world, which we've already, or Klagesian cosmos. There is, human doesn't seem too central here.
Yeah, that's right. And in fact, there are moments in the Science of Character where he hints at his broader metaphysical outline. We've already talked about this concept of Geist, but that's why I think it's such a useful book, because he places it in the context of character. He takes us through the various fundamental notions of character, the three zones of character, as he calls them. He talks a lot about memory as opposed to the capacity for recollection. He introduces what he calls the six fundamental concepts of psychology. And in the midst of it, he then, in a couple of paragraphs here and there, brings in this idea of Geist, spirit, mind, intellect, difficult word to translate, but something which is rationalizing and therefore inimical to what's really going on in life. And that's when this faculty, this aspect of selfhood, the soul, die Seele, comes into play as something which is being disrupted. We talked earlier about the penetrative imagery that's there. It's being cut off. It's being directed. It's being driven away from this appreciation of other souls in what he calls, to use his key concept, images or Bilder. And so the project of characterology, as is worked out by Klages in the Science of Character, is a kind of counterpoint to and a path into this metaphysics, which has as its key idea the reality, the effectiveness, the quality of having an effect, die Wirklichkeit. So much more than reality. It's the living reality, der Bilder, of images, which is to say, this is the anti-materialist aspect of Klages' thought as well.
Okay. There's two questions there, because you mentioned the soul, which of course, I think for many in the West, much like thinking about it now, you know, how we will struggle to divorce our understanding of psychology from Freud, even though we, you know, and even terms such as ego, this is almost like a grammar which we've accepted whether or not we want to or not. The soul as well is probably, I would argue that we have a Judeo-Christian appreciation of the soul, whether or not we realize that or not. But there's another thing that I know we're both very fond of, and had a short-lived place on the main stage of culture, which is characterology. We sort of skipped over that word, and you'll find, if you look up characterology, you'll see a list of thinkers, all of whom have really been considered radical or ignored. I mean, we have, of course, Wilhelm Reich, and I believe Otto Gross, who I'm going to do an episode on soon. And everyone in characterology is really someone who had a few years and then we don't talk about them anymore. So what, I guess, before we move through to the soul, what is characterology, and also why does it tend to attract these radical people?
Yeah, that's right. And Klages does pay tribute to the significance of thinkers like Julius Barnson, but before him as leading the way. Why is characterology so important? Well, because I suppose it's a way of talking about our lived experience, to use the phrase, but with an emphasis on this notion of living experience. In chapter 2, Klages directly addresses the question. Another reason why I think this is a great book is because some of the clearest examples of Klagesian writing can be found in it, and that's not always readily available. And he says that there's at least 3 meanings to the word character. He starts off with this wonderful Goethe quotation from Torquato Tasso: Es bildet ein Talent sich in der Stille, sich ein Charakter in dem Strom der Welt. So there's this idea of character as being something which is developed in our engagement with the world, and that's one part of it, but he doesn't think it's all of it. He also then links it up to the idea, this is the second definition of it, of personality. Okay? And again, we could look at the trajectory of the idea of personality as something which in our postmodern or post-postmodern world tends to fall away. The key aspect here, he thinks, is the idea of the person in the sense of the unity. So how can the unity be created? And this is where he's maybe the most open to misinterpretation, misunderstanding, misuse, one might say, is when he talks about the character of a people, which he exemplifies by talking about their dialect. He's thinking of the character of a building, a landscape, a tempest, a storm, or even something, he says, like number, line, and geometry. So that comes down to this sense of character, that elusive but very, very important sense in which we recognize character. We recognize character in a person, in a building, in a work of art, in a wine. If you're doing wine tasting, people often say, well, this wine has good character to it. And that's something which is very, very hard to explain, but it's definitely there if you've got a very good wine.
I mean, oddly, I'll draw in a French philosopher, Michel Serres, talks about wine a lot, and he says, it's almost an encapsulation of time, because you have grapes which will only grow once from a certain family, from a certain region, from a certain place, and you have this encapsulation of character time, and in that sense, something like a Coca-Cola is the absolute degradation of character, because it's a repetition of the same thing over and over again. So that's another question there to bring in, is for Klages, can character almost devolve? Can it melt? Because it seems we're losing character.
Absolutely, and I think that's why there is, as well as a theory of history that's available in Klages' writing, there is also a very important aspect of Kulturkritik as well. And again, that's kind of in parallel to the way that Freud has a theory of history, Primal and all that stuff, and also criticism of the modern world as well, albeit on a different theoretical basis that we've talked about. But I think that Michel Serres little analysis of wine is profoundly Klagesian in many ways, because it's undoubtedly there if you can but taste it, if you can but take the time to engage with the wine and to respect it. You might want, I suppose, a little ritual that goes with around the wine, pouring the wine, the environment when you're drinking it, and so importance of temperature. So these ritual aspects don't simply have to be religious ones, or don't only have to be religious ones as there. And at the same time, particularly at the moment where health officials are going around warning you, well, alcohol's bad for this, dangerous for that, and so on. So it can be tabooed as well in the same way. Or it can be completely subverted, as suggested by the mass standardized product like Coca-Cola. And that would be a very good example, because Klages sees character, as you suggested, as something which is under threat in the modern world, which is indeed dissipating, and all of this due to a process which he calls Tablonisierung. That is to say, standardization, so that products become more and more standardized. He also thinks that people become more and more standardized, and those elements of character are being eroded. Those elements of the soul, that opportunity for the soul to express itself, for us to have, if you like, in a Klagesian sense, a soulful relationship to life, becomes increasingly impossible because of the over-rationalized, hyper-intellectualized, hyper-will-driven environment in which we find ourselves. And so that does mark the negative aspect of Klages' thinking as well, his Kulturkritik at any rate, and what he sees as problematic in the 1920s is, here we are a whole century on, almost as it were, by prediction, coming to life, coming into being.
So to ask the not the risky question, but jumping back to the impetus of this conversation, the Arctos article, we have that notion there that Klages is wary of standardization in also of not just products but people as well, and I can see there why that might be conflated with some idea that he has some belief of superiority, like it's winding down and we need to return, is the classic word, to a superior time. Is it that idea, like, especially as characters also applied to races for Klages, but this seems to be more in line of like the Nietzschean sense of the traits of an Englishman or a Nordic culture or whatever culture, once again characters of culture. So is there this reactionary sense of we should have stayed at this point of time, or is there something more nuanced going on there?
Okay, well, there are two things on that, because just to pick on one point is that we do find in Klages' writing a notion of race. He talks about Rasse, as indeed does Nietzsche, and does indeed does Freud. And to my mind, if you look at the way that Klages is using it, he's using it in the way that one would in the 19th century to talk about, I don't know, the race of Englishmen or something like that. That isn't the way we would express ourselves nowadays. But he's talking, when you look at it, about the lived cultural, social, religious experience of these people. It's never a biological definition. One of Klages' great works, early works, 1913. His address, Mensch und Erde, humankind, mankind, humankind, and Earth. Well, we look at the Earth, say, you might think, well, is this some sort of Blut und Boden kind of thing? Well, no, it isn't. It's the Earth almost as a kind of ecosystem, almost as Gaia, almost as a totality. He doesn't use the terminology of other different cultures because that belongs really to the later part of the 20th century. But that's the point that he's making when you look at it in context. And so I think to my mind, it's a simple misprision of what Klages is, one, about, and two, what he has to offer. If one sees him as wanting to repeat a kind of, rather sterile identitarian line about, well, that's German and that's good, and that's not German and that's bad. That isn't how it works at all when you read his writings. In fact, in many respects, again, a bit like Nietzsche, he reserves some of his most biting and sarcastic negative comments for the Germans themselves.
It did just cut out a little bit. So I got the bit about non-identitarian, but you were saying the world as Gaia. So is it and in relation to humankind and the Earth? So yeah. Is that we are all part of the singular ecosystem? So there isn't that biological focus in the sense of identitarian biological separation, but there's a character like a building of character separation.
It's this point that he makes, this view that he has of human beings as the bearer of spirit, as the bearer of Geist, of hyper rationalization. So when he talks about the human being, he talks about the human being as consisting of the two poles of body and soul. And I think you're right. It's hard not to have Judeo-Christian echoes going off when one hears it, but it's really much closer to the ancient Greek idea of psyche. And it might be easy to talk about body. And again, he doesn't talk about körper, but he talks about Leib. So it's embodiedness. So body and soul might be best translated as embodiedness and psyche, which sounds a bit complicated. So that's why one tends to use the terms body and soul. But embodiedness and psyche are split apart from each other, these two poles, as he refers to them, by this acosmic power of the Geist, which disrupts that relationship, which erupts into history, and is responsible for all our woes. And of course, it sounds like a little kind of, how shall I say, science fiction drama that he presents at when we're talking about acosmic powers and so on. But I think that is him being very precise in his understanding what he means by the Geist, because it is not the Hegelian Geist. It is certainly not a Christian Geist. It's not the Heidegger Geist, but it is Geist in the sense of a thought which is outside space and time, in the same way that rationalization, logocentrism, might be another term for it, is outside space and time. If we reduce our lived existence to a spreadsheet, that for Klages is the absolute perfect example of the way the Geist works. That livedness, that vivacity, that richness of experience has become just a few figures which can be manipulated on by computer programs.
And there's this quote here by Klages from Science of Character: "Man as such is no longer seen or known, but only an intellectual mechanism, the servant of an external purpose." So I guess that would be the servant of Geist.
Yeah, that's right.
And so we need to re-enter the body. We need to re-enter that. Well, this is a question because I'm having a relationship with the Geist. Speaking of all these practical things, what should I do? How should I, or what are the functions? Right? How do I standardize my psychology? Is this a text in that sense of how man can comport himself or embody himself away from the Geist to deal with the Geist in his own will, or is there a different approach for Klages of what man is to do in this world?
Right. Yeah. 2 points to that. I think it would be fair to say that Klages is not of the view that we have to go back to the past. I think he quite explicitly says this in places that that there is no way back. So he's not a recidivist thinker in that way. If only we go back to the good old days, which are a long way back. I mean, he cites this mythical people, or even pre-mythical people, if you will, of the Pelasgians, as being that was the best time. So long way back, you're not going to get that. And so there is a kind of Wehmut, there is a kind of melancholy as well. But he says, our life, our culture, our civilization is becoming exhausted, is becoming tired, and it needs to be not so much revivified as we need to accommodate ourselves to this exhaustion. And that's why he talks about at the very end of Geist als Widersacher der Seele, where he talks about we just have to be open for those moments of happiness when they come, and to do things as best as we can. And after this huge metaphysical system, this seems a very, very sort of modest proposal. But actually, of course, it's very hard in many ways, because if you accept Klages' analysis, we're more likely or not to be full of negative energies or drives, or a disposition that he would see as psycho-rationalized, and actually making us ill, actually making us hysterical is the term that he uses in the Science of Character. So there is no way back. But there is something that can be done in terms of accommodating oneself one can at this particular moment. And he does open up the way, is the suggestion that there can be a kind of accommodation with Geist. And that's why I think it's always wrong for people to describe Klages as anti-intellectual and anti-rational, he makes the point of one of his writings where he says, look, logical reason is fine. It points to the truth. It can't get us to it. And so reason and intellect, and you've just got to look at Klages' writings, all 9 volumes of the Sämtliche Werke. You've just got to look at the incredibly elaborate syntax with which he expresses himself, is that this isn't someone who is slapdash. This is someone who is extraordinarily precise in the way that he goes about his thinking. And the categories that he produces in the science of character are both precise and yet in many ways flexible as well, because it's relying, as I say, not on the identification of types. So it's not a Jungian kind of typology that's there, but an understanding of the dynamic forces that are at work in the individual.
Well,
does that answer the point about what the individual is to do, though? Maybe.
I think it does. But the individual is always going to. It seems the individual is always going to struggle to not get caught up, or should we say, possessed by the Geist in doing that. In I should do this, and then you end up once again into a routine, a structure, a standardization. So you move away, and then it seems to be perhaps an ongoing process relationship with constantly exercising the Geist from your life. But I feel I must bring him in because, of course, we've mentioned all your other interests, and Goethe seems to play a key role in this book, almost to the extent that Klages is perhaps actually having a conversation with. This characterology could almost be described as becoming a sort of a Goethean. I think he's a Goethean active man. Yeah,
that's right. He has recourse. Klages has recourse in the science of character to a kind of standard representation of the different tendencies within the human being, as exemplified by Goethe on the one hand and Schiller on the other. And he quotes the famous Geburtstagsbrief, birthday letter, which Schiller writes to Goethe, and Schiller highly intellectualized, very, very conceptual basis of his thought, and aesthetic, almost ascetic in his outlook. And he sees Goethe as representing something which is very different, something which is very vital, something which is very living, something which is very sensual, and so on. And the point of the birthday letter, which Schiller writes to Goethe, is, apart from being an extraordinary exercise in self-psychology, is the remarkable generosity of spirit in which he goes by saying, look, this is what I have, and it's fundamentally intellectual. This is what you have, and it's fundamentally vital. But there can be cooperation and friendship between these two ideals, as indeed there is between us. And of course, the intellectual, the aesthetic, the creative partnership between Schiller and Goethe was and is remarkable. And I think that when Klages chooses this, he's partly wanting to situate himself in this tradition of relationship between classicism and romanticism, but he's also wanting to suggest that you work with material that's there. You work with what he calls, in a deceptively simple way, what he calls the Stoff, the material of character, and he discusses. He sets out in the science of character that there are 3 zones, as he calls them: the Stoff, or the material, that is to say, mind, feeling, and will. Something which works in essentially a quantitative way. There is something he calls Gefüge, or structure, the dispositions, the relative, the relations between these different aspects of ourselves, or different aspects of the material. And then something which is difficult to grasp. He talks about it as Artung, the nature, the different kinds of driving forces, the different kind of directions. His German gets quite baroque in its expressiveness, but he talks about Richtungseigenschaften. That is to say, the directional qualities. And my point is not simply to rehearse this model that he offers of the self, but to show how it is essentially relational, both in relation to oneself and in relation to other people as well. And that, to me, is what makes it so interesting.
Does Does this become a school? Does this book influence anyone in terms of characterology, or can we see this influence anywhere today, or was it? It seems quite a singular volume in a way.
Well, it forms one of the big pillars of Clargesian thought. I mean, one definition one could give of what is Charakterkunde is to say, well, it's volumes 4 and 5 of the collected works, or the sämtliche Werke. How was it taken up? But there is evidence in English-speaking journals in the 30s of notice being taken of Klages. But I think it would be difficult to say that it was really elaborated very far. Klages suffers from the fact that he never had a school of Clargesians. There were people who worked, who admired him, who worked with him. I'm thinking of people like Werner Deubel, Hans Egbert Schröder, who wrote his biography. But there is no school in an organized sense. And of course, that's one of the things that's been to Klages' disadvantage, because whereas Freud and Jung were able to set up their institutes and their international organizations and societies, that never really happened with Klages. He remained very much kind of one-man show, both when he was doing his lecture tours around Europe in the 20s and 30s, and then subsequently after the Second World War, he becomes increasingly forgotten, because a different kind of paradigm comes into play. You have not only psychoanalysis, but you have the essentially Marxist kind of thinking, which comes in, and he isn't really going to be congenial to those who have only looked at the way that Ernst Bloch talks about Klages as propagating a kind of Tarzan human being. Again, a very superficial engagement, I think we'd better say, with Klages. In a way, of course, that's what made Klages spangling and new and fresh and full of opportunity, is that he is ripe, I think, for rediscovery, as a thinker who offers a non-psychoanalytic view of the self. And that view of the self, and of course that's going to be the difficult sell these days, is that in fact it's not all about the self. It's not all about the ego. It's not all about the ich. What is it about? Well, it's about the soul. It's about its relationship to other souls. It's about its relationship to the past, and it's about how one lives in a world that one doesn't understand in materialist terms, nor in Judeo-Christian spiritual terms, but in what he puts in this fascinating phrase, die Wirklichkeit der Bilder. A world as a dynamic world of images, which has to be apprehended through what he calls contemplation or Schauung. And I think if we were going to try and look for a key lesson in the science of character, then I think it's this one, where he wants to illustrate what he means by Schauung by giving us the example of someone, he says, contemplating a gleaming jewel, for example, in a shop window, and is held fast in the contemplation. Let there be present in that person at first only the feeling of himself and the image of the jewel. And now let there happen what in full strength is granted only to few, although its rudiments, if the object be suitably chosen, for example, the sight of a setting sun or the form of the beloved person, are, after all, known to everybody. The contemplating subject is absorbed in the contemplated object. Then consciousness has become a mirror, empty, except for the blaze of the jewel, and the feeling of ego is extinguished before the supreme power of the image. An individual who's become pure contemplation knows of no existence and has forgotten himself, and nevertheless is in a state of ardor, compared with which the loftiest content of thought grows pale. They're freed from the trammels of solitary existence and become the reflected content, and through it become that of which it is in itself not part, but the vision and the symbol, world, infinity, and universe. I think that for me, what's so important about Klages is his insistence on the experiential dimension of what he's talking about, this kind of great moment, which he thinks isn't going to come all the time, but the times when it does are, in his view, a transformative and deserve our appreciation and respect.
So I have to ask, what is the soul for Klages? We sort of skipped over that a little bit.
I think the soul functions in a variety of ways. On one hand, he talks about it. He has a little definition where he says, "Soul is the sense of the body. The image of the body is the appearance of the soul." I think, I'm any wiser from that, and so on. He also relates the souls to the images, and the images in terms to the ancestors. So I think there is an implicit differentiation of meanings. That the word soul, psyche, mean different things in different contexts, and by thinking of it as psyche, one has to divorce oneself from one's more modern understanding and from the Judeo-Christian understanding of it, and say that it is that capacity within the individual for Anschauen, for contemplation. And what is it that the individual is going to contemplate? Then it's going to be like in the example of the jewel that I was just citing. It is the world, infinity, and universe. It is an opening up of the individual self in a way that extinguishes consciousness, extinguishes the ego, the rational ego, the ich in that way, by going over into I think it would be fair to say, mystical contemplation of an object and of the vitality, in that sense, the divinity of the world.
That does make sense. How would you advise people to approach this book specifically? Because I don't know if you would agree with me, but I mean, Klages has a strange style, and he has not only a strange style, he has a strange approach to writing that takes a strange flow, I would say, that takes a little bit of work to get used to, where he moves forward in a way that you don't expect. So on starting this book, it's a bit like, ooh, where are we?
Yeah, I don't know. I think that's a very good point. And again, that's partly because our sense of expectation has been so preformed and predetermined by Dr. Freud and his followers or not followers, that it can be difficult to divest ourselves of that kind of intellectual framework and so on. What I advise people to do is to approach it with, first of all, a recognition that he is extremely difficult to translate. And whilst there are some translations of Klages which are tendentious, even the most best-willed of translators, I think, finds themselves challenged considerably by Klages. So one to be aware that there might be terminological shifts which are not easy to identify. Also that a concept like Artung is sometimes not really translated as the idea of a differentiated species, would be one way of putting it. It's a different kind, so it's a kind of variety, would be one way of putting it. Tends not to be translated in that sense. But those are the negatives. The positives are, I think, to approach it in an open mind and to be aware of the architecture of the argument that's presented. Because what Klages is trying to do, I think, in the course of Science of Character, is to take us from the individual self and the notion of character, explore a non-psychoanalytic way of understanding that self, which leads to deeper metaphysical considerations. At the end of the day, if what he says is to be believed or is to be granted as kind of essential in his philosophy, this whole point about the deleterious intervention of Geist into our life, he's going to take us there, but then he's going to take us back again and into our lived experience of reality, hopefully enriched by the knowledge of what we've learned, and with our own capacity for Schauen, for Anschauen, that will have been awoken. And so in that respect, it's also important not to forget those pull-out pages, those diagrams which are at the back, and which might make the best starting point of all is to look at what he calls the system of driving forces, and the 3 pages that are there. Second table, the personal self-assertion of egoism. Plenty of everyday aspects of egoism where one can test whether Klages has got it right or not. I think we'd all agree. And then finally, table 3, and the shortest of all, what it calls the table of self-estimation. And one might look at this and think, what on earth is that all about? But he does try and explain it. And I think if one can get one's interest engaged by those tables, and with the caveats that I mentioned, one can then plunge into the science of character and begin to see how it's a remarkably well thought through exposition of a system which is not like any other system I've ever come across.
That sounds like a good place to finish up. Is there anything you'd like to add about the science of character that you feel we should touch on?
No, I've enjoyed talking about it with you. And just to say that I think Klages always makes the point that as well as being an intellectual, he's describing the things that are going on around us as well. And so even when one's not actively reading the science of character, one could maybe think, oh, is that example of what I've seen in everyday life? Can we use Klages to understand that in a non-psychoanalytic way as well? So in that sense, Klages does offer us a kind of toolkit for vitalist living all the time.
Well, there we go. Paul Bishop, it's been great once again. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Jake. Enjoyed it. Thank you.